Hi guys, my name is Boradante. As many of you may know, lately I've been focused very much on finishing Outlandish Curiosity, the book I work on together with the writer Kevin Folk. Right now I'm determined to finish all the pages by the end of summer. And today I wanted to cover my new look at working in layers. The last 8 pages or something, since I started working on the last part of the book, I started doing everything pretty much segregated in layers like this. And it's very different from the way I used to work. Before that, I used to go in just using layers as simply stages. So pretty much only one layer is necessary here, everything else is just for legacy or comparing the progress. And I've made quite a few videos on this channel about layers and how I used to be working with them sometimes and why I don't like them. And pretty much usually it comes down to the fact that if you're using layers, you kind of spend more time thinking about them and being restricted to them instead of, thinking on the picture, on the flow, on the composition, completely with no strings attached, just thinking on how things really should go when you're building the composition from scratch. And of course, working in one layer really helps you make your artwork look a lot more traditional. And at the same time, I looked at working in layers in 2 possible ways. One of them, you would break down the whole image into separate objects and then separate those objects into separate parts of rendering, the way a 3D render would work in passes. So you have the color of the surface, you have reflections, you have light, you have another light of a different color or just from a different angle, and you combine all of them in correct blending modes to make sure they look appropriate. But that experiment you can find my very old videos on stuff like that. I dropped that method a long time ago, switching to just painting in color and in one layer right away. That was a huge switch for me. And since then, I pretty much always worked in one layer, with the very rare exceptions of maybe not aerial perspective, but I used to call it complex volumetric effects. Like for instance, in this image, I made sure that this beam of light going from the flashlight of our diver here, it's in a separate layer because it's incredibly hard to keep it consistent while you're working on the creature, for instance, making sure that you're grabbing colors of the background or of the creature here and there, and you will be messing it up all the time. It will be really hard to work on the picture while making sure that this beam, this gradient is just right and not getting very weird and spastic right next to all the surfaces or whatever, or next to our diver as well. So pretty much in here, I think I had 3 layers. All of the background with the creature, then the layer with the beam of light, and then the layer with everything that's on top of the beam of light. So that would be the diver, and probably in the same layer I had these extra parts of the creature in the foreground. But all of that segregation happened solely to make sure I get to work with the beam of light correctly. And here's an example where I worked on all of it in one layer. Pretty much works well, but as you can see, not a lot of stuff going on behind the gradients of light. Whenever details start, it kind of disappears somewhere and not really affecting as much. I feel like the fog would be a bit stronger in this part in here. So this is one of the things that I realized a while ago, that volumetrics like this, some kind of fogs that have complex, sharp gradients that need to stay clean and specific, they shouldn't in any way react to the edges of other objects that you're painting, so you gotta separate them. And another one good example worth mentioning is particles. If you, for instance, have a very rainy scene, in the background that rain would pretty much work as some kind of strong, intense aerial perspective that totally can work in one layer. But if you have separate water drops in front of your main character, you really don't want to work with those. You should either add those at the very end And even then, you will be quite limited to how you would be able to work with the shapes of these drops. So it would be kind of a struggle to work it inside of one layer. So another and better option would be to make the rain in a separate layer and be able to move those particles anywhere you want. And pretty much on that, my work with layers usually ended. All of the picture worked in one layer. And my main defense to that was that if something is touching the edges of the main character, or the main character is touching the edges of something else, according to like traditional art and the way things should have their details spread and adjusted to the whole picture in harmony, usually you need to like fade the edges away next to some other edges, sort of. It's like a thing, and it works quite naturally in regards of working in one layer, because you don't need to make sure that the edge is sharp and clean and meets the other edge perfectly, because it still needs to kind of fade away to show that this is in the back and this edge of another object in the foreground, it's in the front. So that's usually the way it works always. But then I started appreciating shape design. And that's where everything became very obvious to me and started making a lot of sense in terms of why I should be using layers. So in many of the recent scenes, I really got into like making sure I create clean, strong shapes. And while it affected the art style quite a lot again, I really decided to embrace it, since the whole book is pretty much like, on one hand is the journey of Gilbert through this magical land, but on the other hand it's like my own art journey. Since it took so many years, I was trying different things, and you can kind of follow that through the pages. And in this case, when I started separating things, I wasn't thinking about, oh, how great it is that I can, work on the edges of the foliage behind the edge of the fish in here, I don't care much about that, obviously, because they still need to adapt and kind of tone down next to the edges of the foreground object and everything. I still do that, I still think about it, more or less. But what I'm really happy about is that I can make sure I make strong, confident brushwork, like lines and shapes of all the objects, without the fear that I'll mess up another object that has a completely different shape, language, or direction going on. So foliage is doing its own thing, while the fish and the water drops are doing a completely different thing, and Gilbert over there is chilling in his own shape, And this is the main improvement in here. While I also noticed, at this page it's pretty clear in here as well, I started making everything appearing a bit more flat because of that, because I really appreciate these strong and clean, choppy shapes now, because of this new philosophy of shape design. So I feel like sometimes I need to go back and think through a bit more, maybe shade more how objects curve into the depth, adding more Fresnel effect, because that stuff is missing in many cases in here. Not a lot of Fresnel effect going on. When I was working in one layer, I didn't feel like I can work with strong shapes, so all I had was, making sure I render and polish all these mushy shapes everywhere with these, you see these contour reflections, and they're looking really nice and naturally merging into the Fresnel effect across the object, giving you a very nice deep rendering with the reflections. It's a much more rich looking rendering. And in here, everything is looking a lot more flat. While this is far from the final version of the page, actually, still, this is one of the things that changed a lot. And it's not a problem, I just need to make sure I don't forget about that and make sure I go back and, polish the shapes a little bit. Make sure that the edges truly curve away and, surfaces get their full rendering. And it's not a problem to go back at all, because first of all, everything is separated in layers. And secondly, these pages, maybe both of them were painted in the same time as I painted this one page. It's so much easier. I noticed I get to something that looks way closer to the final product when I have at least just grounds separated in layers, comparing to working in just one layer. So while still it looks kind of more flat than the previous method, I achieved this clean and kind of a polished look in no time comparing to the one layer approach. And this is such a huge deal. Generally, this is something that shape design in general lets you approach. So any kind of raw brushwork becomes something that may stay as a final product simply because these big brushstrokes, they're already kind of cool looking because you thought through their design from the very start. And still, like, I look back, I constantly like, this is looking so unfinished. And at the same time, in here, I have pretty much the same size brushwork, and it's looking way more fortunate, and I don't feel that bad of, you know, keeping it as is. In here as well, it's pretty quick brushwork. You can almost count the amount of brushstrokes I have in here on the clouds as well. It's a very quick artwork. And in here, you can see much smaller brushwork going on over here, and it's looking way less finished, simply because I just was working in this completely different philosophy of working on objects, not really thinking about the flow and the cleanliness of the brushwork. So this is a huge transformation in that regard, and I really noticed that this approach is a huge deal. And going back to one of my main concerns about working in separate layers, which was inability to fluently search the composition, you know, just the objects, throwing things around with no strings attached. Well, actually, you can do that totally in one layer when you're just beginning. As I've had this one layer artwork, like quick sketch, in full color, like I was going for final colors, final contrast, but in a very quick, like drafty look with no details. So pretty much my last 8 pages or something, the workflow was I just open a page that has this kind of artwork prepared, which was also initially a quick sketch, and then I transform all of them into a colorful version like this. And after that, I get in. I remember before I started using layers, what happened in the beginning was always I open a page like this, and it's like, whew, where the hell do I start? Like, do I like choose a smaller brush and like start polishing? But I should start like from the back, I guess, because everything will get ruined, you know? And it's just overwhelming because so much detail, so much stuff going on, and everything is just like marked in a little bit. And now you have to make sense out of all of it like cheese. But now all I really did was coming in with a selection tool like a lasso and selecting the foreground. Then maybe using the select and mask thing and making sure, you know, it follows the brushwork a bit better. And then just creating a separate layer like this. And then I do the same thing with Gilbert over here. Super quick selection, like it's all drafty anyway, it doesn't matter. Applying the same thing, separate layer. So now we have this going on. And everything else can pretty much stay the same. Usually I'll also separate the pages from each other. And then I clip mask like this, and here I have a page. Here's one layer, here's another. Then I usually would go into the background layer, and I would remove everything that I put on a layer on top. Like the bottom doesn't really matter because we are not seeing it. So just quick drafty thing, removing all of these water drops because they have nothing to do in our forest here. And this is something to start with, you know? And while I'm at it, you know, maybe clean up the shape already a little bit, like just search for a cleaner outline of the body. Then I remember I also thought of making the stone that he's sitting on a part of the background, because why not? We don't have a lot going on in there, so maybe it would look something like this. And already, while I just did this simple act of separating things into layers, I'm already getting much cleaner structure of the page that is so much easier to, turn into a final product. I already know where to start with. I'm starting with just the outlines, the edges of all the important things, of all these grounds. So I'm just cleaning it up a little bit, adding maybe like sky reflections on the edges, looking for separate water drops. And refraction, like the distortion from the water, is one thing that I decided will be just the part of the layer of the water, because it's completely different from what's going on in the back. It's not transparency. So I'm literally just painting whatever I'm seeing on this, like the stone in the back will be slightly affecting the colors of the water in the front. And working with that, then it's so easy to, get in and search a better shape of this fin. And what I'm thinking about is like the flow of how the water would be actually acting, considering what the fish is doing. And so already, while I just did this separation, I already have a much cleaner, much more readable main story. Because what I did was I created the structure of layers that is directly talking to what's important. I separated the important things: Gilbert, the fish, and the background. So now I have clean, confident edges, silhouettes, and shapes of the main three things. Or two things. The background is its own thing. And yeah, just keep working, keep cleaning things up, using that transparency that helps you quite a lot. Everything becomes a lot easier. It's like the whole thing is just helping you because the whole structure of the document is now talking to what's important. So this is an interesting point of, not separating all the little details like, well, the clock on the chest of Gilbert's also has its own edge. Why not we separate that? That was also one of my concerns about working in layers. Like, if you start separating things in layers, what if you have 500 objects, like parts of your outfit of your character? Will all of that be in a separate layer? No, because those are not as important as the character overall. The character overall is the main point of the image in here. We're looking at what Gilbert is experiencing, like how he feels when he's looking at the fish. So that's why Gilbert himself and his posture and, his smile and whatever, those are the things that matter. The clock and these little parts, they don't matter. They don't necessarily need an incredibly clean and confident, shape definition. And one technical tip about Photoshop specifically, something I never used before, mostly because I never worked in layers that much, some time ago they introduced like a new way of selecting layers. If you go to this Move tool, it has this button. I remember it appeared here, I don't know, like 3-4 years ago maybe. And its point is that when you have this tool selected, when you're just clicking on a layer, you will be selecting it right away. I'm not even holding any key or anything. I'm just clicking and I'm selecting this layer, and I'm moving it right away. So it's just obvious, like grab and move, no matter what layer it is. Before that, if this is not checked, the old school way would be this thing is just moving no matter what you're grabbing at. But if you hold Control and click on a different layer, then you select a different layer. And while it's not a big deal, pretty much they kind of switched the mode. Now you just don't have to hold Control really. That's the only difference, This new mode unlocks a very cool thing specifically for artists, the ones that mostly use the brush tool. Thing is, many of you guys probably know that when you paint, if you hold Control, you can just, move the layer around. It's just the thing. It's really cool to hold Control and move things around. But you couldn't hold Control and click on a layer and switch to it. But with this new mode, you actually can. So you're literally painting in one layer, then Control clicking on another layer, and I'm already over there. And clicking again, I'm in the background now. Clicking here, I'm in Gilbert's layer again. and it's immediate. You're just so unlocked with that. Of course, it doesn't solve the main issue of, working for 10 minutes and then realizing all of that was painted in a different layer. But I think it's not a huge problem usually, because if nothing is obstructing your view, that means you're in a transparent part of a layer on top, so you can easily select whatever you have, cut it out, and paste it into the correct layer. So it's never that big of a deal. You can work with that. Yeah, and here I also had 3 layers. One of them is water splash, because it was going all over the place, all over the fish, and having its own flow. That was one of the things. Like, I needed the waves in the background having their own dynamic and cool flow, while the water drops obviously need this kind of flow, so they were separated for that reason as well. And yeah, the fish is right here in between the drops, looking pretty cool. And of course, working with a client, recently on this page, on the right page, we decided to change the mood quite a lot, so it's everything is in the same place, but it needed to have a much moodier, different look, not a sunny day. It was so much easier to do that. Like, I pretty much didn't have to touch neither this layer nor this layer nor this layer. Everything stayed intact, and I was only working on the background layers, changing the weather in there. So that was also a great benefit, obviously, but I think everyone realizes that right away. Layers help changing things faster. But yeah, this was my main takeaway from it. Layers work perfectly well with the idea of shape design and, conveying a good message, the main message of the composition, by separating those main messages. So in here I have a clean, strong silhouette, and then I have a clean shape of this house over there. 2 important things, slightly overlapping each other, yet not being in the way of each other's messages. So that was so cool to finally have that. So yeah, this is it. Tell me guys what you think about working in layers. Do you guys work in them? Do you have any cool approaches or maybe tutorials about that? Someone who's really mastering that? Feel free to share that info with the others in the comment section. And that'll be it. Check out the merch on the Borrow store. The link is in the description. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye! Man, we're actually changing so much. I think if we wouldn't be changing anything, I would have been already done today with all the pages, but the final several pages are changing quite a lot. The message and the action in that, I don't want to spoil it, but I think it will be very interesting for you guys to see in the final book when it comes out.